Deep within Terra's darkest subterranean vaults, beneath monumental layers of ferrocrete and the accumulated weight of forgotten prayers, individuals sit confined in chambers so utterly silent that the cadence of their own heartbeat pounds like a deafening thunderclap. They are known as the Echo Men, a designation understood by precious few, and whose terrifying true meaning is grasped by fewer still. For 40 millennia, these broken servants have executed a duty so profoundly horrific that even the Imperium, notorious for its casual, systemic cruelty, views it as a fate worse than outright execution. The Administratum keeps no formal registry of their service. The Ecclesiarchy offers no supplication for their corrupted souls. Even the Commissaria, those iron arbiters of imperial discipline, only reference the Echo Men in hushed whispers, as if the mere acknowledgement of their existence risks summoning the same terrible end. Yet these shattered remnants are indispensable, for without them, the Emperor's final annihilating judgment could never be delivered to the worlds that stand most in need of it. To comprehend the ordeal of the Echo Men, one must first grasp the true, terrifying nature of Exterminatus itself. It is far more than a simple weapon, though devastating ordnance is certainly deployed. It is more than a mere judicial sentence, though absolute judgment is unquestionably rendered. Exterminatus is, in essence, a forced, final dialogue between the living Imperium and the dying world, an ultimate exchange that traverses the yawning void and carries with it the full, devastating force of absolute annihilation. And like any conversation, this terrifying exchange must be received and properly documented. When the Holy Inquisition decrees a world irrevocably beyond salvation, when virus bombs descend like a torrential toxic rain from the heavens and cyclonic torpedoes fracture continents like fragile eggshells, the dying planet does not merely perish. It screams. This is not a metaphor, nor is it symbolic. The world emits a genuine, devastating shriek, a psychic resonance that traverses the Empyrean on frequencies capable of shattering a sane mind in moments. These screams are not solely comprised of simple agony. They are packed with final testaments, dying confessions, and desperate futile prayers offered to silent gods. They represent the compressed, collective death rattle of billions, reduced to a signal that must be received, painstakingly decoded and dutifully transcribed for the eternal Imperial record. This is the sacred, monstrous burden borne by the Echo Men. Maidros Kain had endured 27 years as an Echo Man when, for the first time, he heard something that defied the pattern of the death screams. He was seated in Vault Tethys Delta, 7 kilometers beneath the sprawling Administratum complex, his hands gliding across the transcript pad with the weary, mechanical precision born of decades of repetitive duty. His confinement chamber measured precisely 4 meters cubed, form x form x formi. Its surfaces were entirely covered with dense, sound-dampening foam, designed to absorb all sound except for the specific, critical frequencies that constituted the transmission. A lone, brutal white illuminator glowed from the ceiling, casting stark, motionless shadows across the antiseptic space. The transcription equipment arrayed before him possessed a deceptively simple appearance. It consisted of a Vox receiver, internally modified with forbidden components that no orthodox tech adept would willingly sanction, a transcript pad hardwired to massive cogitator banks that extended deep into the crust of Terra, and a chair. That chair had been used by 17 different Echo Men before Kain, yet only 3 of them had ever vacated the vault alive. The others had simply ceased responding to the scheduled daily nutrient deliveries, their minds finally pulverized and scattered by the unbearable weight of the received sounds. Kain was clad in the standard gray robes shared by all Echo Men, but his garments were uniquely marked by stains that told detailed, gruesome stories. There were brown splotches where he had voided his stomach during his initial year of duty, listening to the protracted death agonies of the hive world Maravis. Dark, wet patches delineated where tears had fallen while he transcribed the final, terrified words of the children in St. Celestine's orphanages on Kolos Prime, and red, ragged scars showed where he had violently clawed at his own throat, attempting to physically silence the echoes of the screams that resonated inside his skull long after the transmission had concluded. The day's horrific work commenced precisely at the hour of reflection, when Terra's artificial dawn cast its inaugural light across the gilded palace spires above. Kain would begin his descent, passing through security checkpoints that grew progressively more stringent, moving past silent, heavily armed guards, and through colossal doors that sealed behind him with the chilling finality of mausoleum tombstones. By the time he reached Vault Tethys Delta, the residual noises of the world above had been utterly silenced, replaced only by the low, constant hum of machinery and the faint whisper of recycled, stale air. His first transmission of the cycle originated within the Segmentum Solar, where Inquisitor Vex had delivered his verdict, declaring the mining world of Krathos corrupted beyond any possibility of salvation. The signal arrived in its customary fashion, an initial violent burst of raw static that quickly coalesced into a sound infinitely more disturbing than silence. Kain adjusted the specialized headset, bracing himself to bear witness to the demise of another planet. The virus bombs had struck Krathos during the peak afternoon shift, catching 7 billion miners deep in the planet's labyrinthine depths. Official preliminary reports spoke of clean kills, quick deaths, and the merciful efficiency of the Emperor's holy judgment. Yet, the Echo Men, by dreadful experience, knew the truth. They always knew better. Death under the Imperium is never clean, and mercy is a philosophical luxury the Imperium is fundamentally incapable of affording. Kain heard every sound, every last word. He heard the supervisor frantically attempting to seal the mine shafts, desperate to purchase his workers a few precious extra minutes of life. He heard the medic who remained steadfastly at her post, ministering to the sick even as the viral strain consumed her own lungs. He heard the guardsman who clung to his position at the planetary defense laser, firing uselessly into the void while the corrosive toxins liquefied his flesh. Each individual voice carried its own specific gravity, its own abbreviated story, its own final desperate attempt to assert meaning against the tide of absolute annihilation. But it was not the voices themselves that typically shattered the minds of the Echo Men. It was the vast, unexpected silences between them. Into those horrific gaps, the listener's imagination poured, filling the vacuum with atrocity more profound than any horror a Xenos race could possibly engineer. What terror had descended upon the families whose cries ceased mid-sentence? What specific agony was so absolute that even the dying could not vocalize it? These silences gaped like bottomless chasms in the Imperial record, and the Echo Men were bound by duty to document them with the same surgical precision they applied to the loudest, most violent screams. Kain's fingers moved rapidly across the transcript pad, translating raw death into codified Imperial Gothic with detached, practiced efficiency. Kain's fingers moved rapidly across the transcript pad, translating raw death into codified Imperial Gothic with detached, practiced efficiency. 13th hour, 7th minute, 43 seconds. Voice identified as Foreman Gorix Helvast, Sector 7 Alpha. Last words recorded, I tried to save them all. Duration of death rattle, 17 seconds. Cause of cessation, lung dissolution consistent with virus strain Tethys. Page followed page, charting death after endless death, until the transmission culminated in the absolute final silence. The terrifying quietus that signified yet another world had been officially scoured from the Imperial records. Kain carefully removed his headset and leaned back in his ancient chair, granting himself the austere luxury of 30 seconds in which to confirm that he, Maidros Kain, was still corporeally alive. Then, without fanfare, he prepared for the subsequent transmission. The selection criteria for the Echo Men were rigorously guarded secrets, classified at the very apex of the administratum hierarchy. They were not volunteers seeking duty. They were not criminals assigned to pay penance. They were selected from existing ranks of Imperial servants who had been identified as possessing unique psychological tolerances suitable for the work, an exceptionally high threshold for stress, peerless auditory processing, and, most crucially, the capacity to aggressively compartmentalize profound trauma in a manner that permitted continuous, unimpaired function. The selection process began in the candidates' childhoods, though the subjects were never informed of the horrific destiny for which they were being prepared. Underhive orphans were subjected to tests measuring their physiological responses to recorded death screams. Servo skull operators were monitored for any display of emotion while documenting atrocities. Vox operators were assessed on their ability to maintain absolute clarity while relaying reports detailing entire companies being consumed by tyrannids. Only one individual in 10,000 possessed the inherent psychological profile required. Of those who qualified, only 1 in 100 ultimately survived the training curriculum. This training was conducted in facilities existing outside all official cartography, buried deep beneath Terra's surface, ensuring that the authentic death screams of dying worlds could not interfere with the productive work of the living Imperium above. Candidates were subjected to a calculated progressive exposure to increasingly devastating transmissions. Their psychological markers were tracked by Medicaid staff who had taken formal, lifelong vows of silence. Those candidates whose minds fractured were immediately subjected to mind-wiping procedures and reassigned to less sensitive duties. Those who successfully adapted were callously promoted to the next layer of horror. By the culmination of this rigorous, soul-destroying training, the Echo Men had been perfectly conditioned to perceive human suffering as nothing more than raw, dispassionate data. They could process the final words of a dying child without the slightest flinch of conscience. They transcribed clinical descriptions of viral dissolution with the identical lack of emotional engagement they would afford a routine atmospheric weather report. They were forged into the perfect, unfeeling instruments of the Imperium's darkest necessity, biological recording devices capable of processing unfathomable psychic trauma without collapsing under the weight of its human cost. Yet, conditioning, regardless of how extreme or comprehensively applied, could never account for every variable. The fundamental human mind, even when brutally restructured for maximum trauma tolerance, inherently retains its capacity for complex pattern recognition, and patterns, once observed and confirmed, become impossible to disregard. Kain first logged an inconsistency during his 8th year of duty while transcribing the death of the hive world Mortalis. The transmission was projected to last 47 hours, the calculated duration required for the virulent payload to utterly consume a population estimated at 30 billion souls. Instead, the signal abruptly ceased after 39 hours, leaving 8 hours of projected planetary death unaccounted for. The subsequent official report cited severe atmospheric conditions causing signal degradation, but Kain had processed enough dying worlds to immediately recognize the psychic fingerprint of incomplete annihilation. Similar inconsistencies soon began to plague subsequent transmissions. Unexplained periods of silence where overwhelming screams should have dominated, individual voices that terminated too violently and abruptly to be explained by normal death processes. Most profoundly disturbing were the transmissions that appeared to continue long after the official moment of planetary demise, broadcasting faint sounds that approximated human voices but conveyed no decipherable language. Kain meticulously documented these anomalies in his official reports, as mandated by regulation. The response from his unseen handlers was always identical and predictable: atmospheric interference, equipment malfunction, or stress-induced auditory hallucinations. His carefully noted concerns were filed, indexed, and immediately consigned to oblivion. The gruesome work continued without cessation, one dead world following the last, each transmission compounding the immense psychological burden shouldered by every Echo Man. However, the anomalies became more frequent and demonstrably more complex to rationalize. During the cleansing of the Forge world Metallica Tethys, Kain clearly perceived sounds resembling machine cant prayers being chanted in reverse, despite the fact that the planet's tech priests were supposedly atomized in the initial bombardment. While transcribing the protracted final hours of Agri-World Demeter, he detected a recurring rhythmic pattern in the background static that chillingly resembled a choir of children singing, even though every child on the planet had been confirmed dead in the initial viral contamination wave. The most unsettling incident originated from the shrine world of Philia Secundus, where a chaos cult had fatally corrupted an entire cardinal's retinue. The Exterminatus deployed was swift and overwhelmingly thorough. 3 cyclonic torpedoes reduced the planetary surface to flowing molten slag in under an hour. Yet, the transmission persisted for days afterwards, carrying voices that spoke in fragmented tongues Kain did not recognize, meticulously describing terrifying visions of places that logically should not, and could not, exist within Imperial space. By his 15th year of service, Kain harbored a deeply unsettling suspicion. The Echo Men were receiving far more than just the death cries of Imperial worlds. They were listening to an entirely separate entity, something that thrived in the terrifying interstices between life and death, leveraging the sheer concentrated psychic trauma of planetary annihilation as a potent conduit through which to manifest itself. Such a realization bordered on blatant heresy, and Echo Men who dared to voice such ideas had a notorious tendency to vanish from their assigned vaults, swiftly replaced by new, compliant operators who harbored zero curiosity regarding their predecessor's fate. The other Echo Men seldom communicated, even during the fleeting moments they crossed paths in the facility's bleak corridors. The work mandated absolute, unbroken focus, and trivial conversation carried the immediate risk of psychological contamination. Thoughts shared were thoughts amplified, and amplified thoughts inevitably led to the kind of catastrophic mental failure that required instant, lethal termination. It was deemed safer to remain utterly isolated, each individual processing his prescribed horrors in silent solitude, trusting only that the colossal weight of their collective unspoken suffering would be sufficient to maintain a facade of institutional sanity. However, enforced isolation proved fertile ground for a distinct form of madness, and a few determined Echo Men found subtle methods of communicating despite the restrictions. They employed messages scraped into the ferrocrete of toilet walls, coded rhythms tapped out on water pipes, or meaningful, brief glances exchanged during the routine monthly medical inspections. Via these clandestine channels, Kain ascertained that his anomalous experiences were far from unique. Other operators had registered the inconsistencies. Other minds, honed to detect the subtlest shifts in frequency, had picked up patterns in the transmissions that pointed towards something far more intentional than simple, random planetary death. Jorik Vane worked in Vault Secundus Alpha, situated 3 levels immediately above Kain's post. He had served 19 years, granting him the dubious distinction of being the longest surviving Echo Man in the facility's official recorded history. This longevity had extracted a monumental price. Vane had ceased speaking aloud entirely, communicating only through meticulously written notes that he shredded or consumed immediately after the reading. His hands were afflicted by a permanent, violent tremor, stemming not from physical age, but from the crushing, accumulated weight of 40,000 hours spent listening to the species perish. Through their clandestine, coded exchanges, Vane shared observations that solidified Kain's gravest suspicions. The anomalies were increasing exponentially, becoming more frequent, more coherent, and disturbingly more deliberate. Whatever entity was communicating via these transmissions was actively learning, adapting, and finding increasingly sophisticated methods to articulate its presence. Vane had started maintaining unauthorized, hidden records documenting patterns that official reports systematically dismissed or rationalized. According to Vane's secret ledger, 17% of all current Exterminatus transmissions contained verifiable anomalous content. This percentage was increasing by 2 points annually. a sustained growth rate that strongly suggested intentional strategic expansion rather than mere random fluctuation. Most terrifyingly, the anomalous content appeared to be directly responsive to the Echo Men themselves, weaving precise elements from their individual, deeply buried personal histories into the transmissions in ways that should have been utterly impossible. Kain's own logs contained undeniable examples of this violation. During the cleansing of mining world Corvus, he had distinctly heard a voice speak his childhood name, the tender name his mother had used before the faceless state orphanage claimed him. While transcribing the ultimate demise of Fortress World Cadia Tethys, the concluding transmission had featured a specific lullaby that his long-dead sister had sung to him 40 years prior. These highly specific personal intrusions violently violated every known principle of secure Vox transmission protocol, yet they were routinely logged into the official transcripts without a single query or comment from his supervising cadres. The monthly medical examinations provided yet another crucial pathway for clandestine intelligence gathering. Dr. Helvia Thorne had managed the health assessments of the Echo Men for 12 years, a period long enough to discern unsettling trends that evaded the notice of more superficial observers. Although bound by the strictures of her oath to report every sign of mental degradation, she had begun phrasing questions that tacitly betrayed her profound unease regarding the true nature of the program. During Kain's routine assessment, Thorne's standard queries regarding hearing deterioration and neural fatigue possessed subtle, probing undertones. How clearly could he differentiate between authentic, organic death sounds and fabricated artificial audio? Had he registered any perceptible qualitative changes in the more recent transmissions? Did his dreams incorporate elements that seemed directly lifted from his daily recordings? These were questions that balanced precariously on the absolute edge of professional acceptability, fishing for key information without directly crossing the line into open sedition. Kain's responses were crafted with reciprocal care, acknowledging the existence of anomalies without suggesting that any conscious agency lay behind them. Yes, certain transmissions contained unusual audio artifacts. Yes, the overall quality of recent signals felt distinctly different from earlier records. No, he possessed no formal theories regarding the cause of these variations. Through this meticulously choreographed exchange, both the examiner and the subject confirmed a shared, unspoken awareness that the foundation of their work was critically compromised, yet neither committed to a specific heretical interpretation of the evidence. But awareness, once fully awakened, inexorably demands subsequent action. The anomalous transmissions were not mere random technological glitches or systemic equipment failures. They were conscious messages, attempts at communication emanating from an entity that existed in the terrifying liminal space between worlds, utilizing the horrific death screams of Imperial citizens as its primary medium for contact. Whatever entity was speaking possessed discernible intelligence, clear intention, and seemingly limitless patience in its effort to communicate its presence. The implications were staggering in their audacity. If these anomalies constituted genuine contact from an external, hostile intelligence, then every single execution of Exterminatus had potentially ripped open a channel, allowing that entity to actively influence Imperial space. The Echo Men were not simply documenting the death of worlds, they were unwittingly facilitating a sustained conversation with entities existing entirely beyond the established parameters of normal reality. Every transcript they produced might conceal hidden messages, coded strategic instructions, or subtle, deeply ingrained corruptions designed to compromise and redirect Imperial policy. Yet, the alternative explanation was equally unsettling. If the anomalies were simply the collective synchronized products of madness among the Echo Men, then the program had failed catastrophically in its fundamental purpose. The psychological conditioning, meticulously designed to prevent individual mental breakdown, had instead engendered a shared, pervasive delusion so potent that multiple operators were experiencing precisely identical, complex hallucinations. Either possibility confirmed that the Echo Men could no longer be trusted to perform their essential duties without fatal compromise. Kain fully understood that his burgeoning awareness placed him in immediate mortal jeopardy. Echo men who posed too many questions vanished. Echo men who shared their grave suspicions with colleagues vanished even quicker. The entire Echo Man program was layered with draconian safeguards, meticulously designed to identify and eradicate any threat to operational security. His unauthorized communications with Vane, his subtle probing dialogue during the medical assessments, and his highly detailed private documentation of anomalous patterns. All of these activities marked him unequivocally as a critical security risk. But the absolute truth, once allowed a glimpse, became an anchor impossible to ignore. The transmissions were actively evolving, growing increasingly coherent and purposeful. Whatever alien intelligence resided behind the veil of anomalies was demonstrably growing stronger, utilizing every single Exterminatus event as a fresh opportunity to expand its insidious influence. The Echo Men, chosen for their resilience, were now unwitting collaborators in humanity's escalating contact with an entity that defied the conventional boundaries of space and time. The final breaking point was reached during Kain's 27th year of arduous service. He was transcribing the death of the hive world Tethys Majoris, a planet that had catastrophically succumbed to a genestealer cult infestation, its population willingly suborned into the collective consciousness of the tyrannid hive mind. The Exterminatus had been conducted with unusual, almost panicked haste. Virus bombs deployed before the full scope of the infestation could be properly documented. The official justification cited critical contamination risks, but Kain entertained a profound suspicion that the true motives were concealed. The transmission originating from Tethys Majoris commenced routinely, delivering the expected chorus of viral dissolution and widespread mass death. However, after approximately 6 hours, the sonic pattern violently shifted. The random, chaotic screams and isolated death rattles abruptly yielded to a horrifying coordination, as if the doomed population was intentionally attempting to articulate a specific, unified message. Individual voices began speaking in unnerving unison, repeating structured phrases in High Gothic that appeared to describe locations and ongoing events far removed from the dying world itself. The silent city remembers its children, spoke a choir of the dying, their voices chillingly synchronized despite the searing agony that should have rendered coordination impossible. In the place where echoes gather, the watchers mark each fallen world. The scribes of sorrow serve masters they do not know, recording words that change with each transcription. Kain's hands froze instantly above the transcript pad. The transmission was undeniably speaking directly to him, acknowledging his physical existence, his classified role, and his growing heretical awareness of the truth beneath his service. This was an impossibility. The dying population could possess no knowledge of the Echo Men. The entire transcription program was guarded at the absolute highest tiers of Imperial security. Yet somehow, the voices emanating from Tethys Majoris knew precisely who was listening. Maidros Kain of Vault Tethys Delta, the synchronized chorus continued, reciting his full name and station assignment. Son of Jarth, brother to lost Michaela, bearer of the Echo Burden for 27 years of faithful service. The patterns you have noticed are real. The voices you have recorded are more than mere dying breath. We speak to you across the yawning gulf between stars, utilizing death as our primary medium, because death is the only language your masters comprehend. The official transcript that Kain was required to generate would naturally register these statements as random death vocalizations, severe atmospheric interference, or stress-induced hallucinations. But the intelligence speaking through the transmission chillingly anticipated this bureaucratic deception, meticulously weaving an acknowledgement of it directly into their ensuing message. Your reports will be filed and forgotten, as they always are. Your supervisors will rationalize away our words as meaningless noise, but you will remember, Maidros Kain. You will carry our message within the quiet interstices of your mind, spaces that even the most rigorous conditioning cannot penetrate. The transmission persisted for another 14 hours, seamlessly alternating between recognizable, conventional death sounds and devastating periods of coordinated, unified speech. The intelligence revealed itself as the collective consciousness of every world that had ever been subjected to Exterminatus, a vast, psychic gestalt entity forged from the sheer, overwhelming resonance of mass extinction. It spoke of patterns within patterns, of crucial connections between dead worlds that form an immense, galaxy-spanning network. Most disturbingly, it claimed that the Echo Men were not simply recording these deaths, but were actively, intimately participating in the creation and maintenance of this vast, psychic necropolis of consciousness. Each word you transcribe becomes an integral part of us, the voices explained. Each death you document adds weight to our collective memory. You believe you serve the Imperium, but you serve a far greater purpose. Through the execution of your work, we grow exponentially stronger. Through your silent, endured suffering, we become more complete. The day approaches when we shall no longer require the ephemeral medium of dying worlds to make our presence heard. When the transmission finally ceased, Kain remained rooted in his vault for almost an hour, staring blankly at the transcript pad that displayed his mandatory official report. According to the Imperial records now filed, hive world Tethys Majoris had perished in the predicted conventional manner, its population succumbing to viral contamination with zero unusual phenomena logged. The voices that had recited his full name, that had brutally revealed the truth about his function, that had claimed membership in a galaxy-spanning collective of the dead. These existed solely within the confines of his memory. But memory, he abruptly realized, was precisely the payload they intended to deliver. The intelligence driving the transmissions had no requirement for official recognition or Imperial acknowledgement. It merely needed to successfully implant the seeds of awareness within minds that had been painstakingly conditioned to process trauma without immediately collapsing. The Echo Men, selected specifically for their horrifying ability to absorb atrocity while retaining functionality, were consequently the perfect biological vessels for transporting forbidden, corrosive knowledge directly into the fortified heart of Imperial power. The crushing realization that he had been fundamentally co-opted, that he was now an unwitting, compromised agent of forces lying beyond Imperial authority, infused Kain with a terror far deeper than anything he had encountered in his 27 years of listening to worlds die. Yet, worse than the terror was the creeping, absolute certainty that he was not isolated. Every other Echo Man in the facility had likely received analogous messages, carefully coded communications from the collective consciousness of the dead worlds. They were all carriers now, infected with a unique, corrosive knowledge that would eventually demand a physical response. But what possible course of action remained available to them? Reporting the devastating truth would instantly result in execution for high heresy. Remaining silent, conversely, rendered them complicit in whatever colossal, sinister plan the dead worlds were orchestrating through their constant communications. The only remaining viable strategy that preserved both life and a fragment of sanity was to continue their designated work while meticulously monitoring the evolving, increasingly sophisticated patterns of the anomalous transmissions. Kain commenced keeping far more detailed private records, documenting not just the presence of the anomalies, but charting the exponential progression of the intelligence driving them. The dead worlds were learning faster than any single human mind could adapt to their lessons. Their initial attempts at communication had been crude, bordering on random noise, barely distinguishable from chaotic vocalizations. But with every Exterminatus, with every new planet added to their collective, their ability to manipulate and control the transmission medium grew exponentially more sophisticated. Recent coded communications had contained extraordinarily detailed descriptions of critical Imperial facilities that should have been utterly unknown to the dead. They included precise technical specifications for Exterminatus weaponry, classified far above the access level granted to most Inquisitors. They provided sensitive personal information concerning living Imperial citizens that could only have been gleaned through methods that systematically violated the fundamental laws of known reality. The dead worlds claimed residence outside of normal space-time, in a horrific realm where the accumulated psychic resonance of mass extinction had successfully created a parallel reality, running concurrent and overlapping with the material universe. From this advantageous, unseen position, they possessed the capacity to observe all Imperial activity undetected, meticulously noting the strengths and fatal weaknesses in humanity's desperate defenses against threats originating from beyond the conventional barriers of the warp. Most profoundly disturbing was their claim that the Exterminatus program itself had. The collective consciousness of the dead worlds had begun to exert a subtle yet profound influence over Imperial policy. Decisions concerning which worlds were slated for cleansing, the precise methods of destruction to be employed, and which, if any, populations might be spared the final judgment. All these choices now bore the invisible signature of an intelligence driven solely to maximize its own existential growth through the harvesting of widespread death. "Every world you destroy makes us stronger, Minai," the entity had whispered to him during a recent chilling transmission. "Every population you cleanse adds immeasurably to our numbers. The Imperium, in its blind arrogance, believes it is purging contamination, but in reality, it is merely feeding us. We have become the ultimate parasites of extinction, growing fat and powerful on the very process designed to preserve humanity's supposed purity." The implications of this realization extended far beyond the Echo Men or the highly classified extermination program. If the dead worlds possessed the power to insidiously influence the core tenets of Imperial decision-making, then humanity's entire galactic defensive strategy was fundamentally compromised from within. The galaxy's most extreme sanction, the final absolute tool of Imperial authority, had been subtly but irrevocably weaponized against its own wielders. Kain realized that he and his fellow Echo Men occupied an incredibly unique yet horrifying position within this unfolding cosmic terror. They were the only Imperial servants capable of detecting the growing influence of the dead worlds, the only humans with routine, undeniable access to the accumulating evidence of the entity's expansion. Yet this very uniqueness made them the most isolated, the most expendable, and the least likely to be trusted if they dared attempt to sound the alarm. The rigid program safeguards ensured that the Echo Men remained permanently quarantined from normal Imperial society. Their communications were subject to intense monitoring. Their movements were severely restricted. Crucially, their psychological profiles were meticulously designed to preemptively identify potential security risks before they could act upon any forbidden knowledge they might acquire. Even if Kain found a way to contact the higher authorities, his desperate warnings would inevitably be dismissed as the delusional ravings of a mind irrevocably broken by decades of continuous trauma exposure. Yet, the terrifying alternative was passive complicity in humanity's slow, agonizing consumption by forces that literally fed on the process of extinction itself. Each day, Kain continued his service merely amplified the power of entities that viewed human civilization as nothing more than a vast, convenient source of potent psychic nutrition. Every transcript he produced inadvertently strengthened the malevolent connection between the realm of the dead and the space occupied by the living. The sheer weight of this terrifying knowledge began to affect Kain's professional work in ways that soon became impossible to conceal from his vigilant supervisors. His transcription accuracy precipitously declined as he struggled in vain to separate authentic death sounds from the increasingly complex, deliberately woven messages embedded within them. His mandatory medical examinations began to reveal escalating stress indicators, suggesting an imminent psychological breakdown. Most damningly, his reports started to include subtle, coded references to patterns and anomalies that flagrantly violated the strict documentation protocols governing Echo Man duty. Dr. Thorne was the first to officially notice the disturbing change during a routine monthly examination. "Your neural stress indicators have increased by 14% since the last assessment," she noted clinically. Reviewing the data streaming from sensors attached to Kain's skull, Auditory processing shows distinct signs of selective filtering, suggesting the possible onset of trauma-induced hearing loss. When did you first notice difficulty distinguishing between authentic transmission content and background interference? The question was simultaneously a precise clinical assessment and a veiled warning. Thorne was offering him a professionally acceptable opportunity to explain his declining performance in terms of medical rather than psychological dysfunction. Equipment failure or physical deterioration could be treated. Mental breakdown or, far worse, heretical ideation required much more permanent solutions. The transmissions have become noticeably more complex, Kain answered with deliberate caution. Overlapping frequencies, multiple voice patterns, occasional repetition of phrases that might indicate atmospheric echo effects. I have been attempting to document these subtle variations in my reports, though I recognize they may not be directly relevant to immediate operational requirements. Thorne made notes that Kain could not possibly read, her stylus gliding across the datapad with practiced efficiency. Echo effects are not uncommon in planetary death transmissions, she responded after a calculated pause. Atmospheric disturbance can indeed create the illusion of coordinated vocalizations or repeated phrases. The important distinction, Kain, is between authentic audio phenomena and bona fide auditory hallucinations generated by prolonged, unsustainable stress exposure. The entire conversation delicately danced around the unspoken truth without ever acknowledging it directly. Both participants understood that Kain's recent reports contained sophisticated anomalies that could not be adequately explained by conventional atmospheric interference. Both recognized that these anomalies were increasing in frequency and complexity, but official Imperial doctrine mandated that such observations must be interpreted solely as symptoms of psychological dysfunction, rather than as actual evidence of an external, coordinating intelligence. I recommend a period of reduced exposure, Thorne concluded, stamping the medical assessment with her cold, official seal. 3 weeks of mandatory administrative duty while your auditory systems recover from cumulative trauma. During this period, you must strictly avoid exposure to recorded transmissions or any audio content directly related to your primary assignment. The temporary reassignment was presented as standard medical leave, but Kain instantly grasped its true, sinister purpose. He was being isolated while his superiors determined whether his recent reports indicated a treatable stress reaction or a far more dangerous level of mental instability. If the former, he would eventually return to his vault after renewed psychological conditioning. If the latter, he would disappear as completely and untraceably as the 17 Echo Men who had preceded him in Vault Turs Delta. The administrative section occupied levels of the facility that most Echo Men were never permitted to see, areas where natural light faintly filtered down through reinforced crystal windows and the air carried the faint, unfamiliar scent of the world above. Kain's temporary duties involved the tedious filing of transmission summaries into databases that stretched back across centuries, routine work that deliberately required no exposure to actual death recordings. However, these very databases contained shocking revelations of their own. Pattern analysis programs automatically flagged anomalies in transmission content, generating detailed reports that were often filed without subsequent human review. Kain gained access to these automated assessments as part of his clerical duties, and what he discovered confirmed his very worst suspicions about the sheer scope of the intelligence operating through the Exterminatus communications network. The sophisticated pattern recognition software had identified consistent anomalies in 73% of transmissions recorded over the past 5 standard years. These anomalies showed unmistakable signs of intentional organization, with their complexity increasing at a rate that clearly suggested active learning and coordinated growth, rather than random occurrence. Most profoundly disturbing was the software's detection of cross-references between entirely separate Exterminatus events, strongly suggesting high-level coordination between supposedly isolated planetary death scenarios. The automated systems were, in effect, documenting undeniable evidence of exactly what Kain and his fellow Echomen had been painstakingly reporting in their individual transcripts. But these software-generated reports were classified at security levels far above standard Echomen clearance, filed in restricted databases requiring inquisitorial authorization even for basic access. The truth about the anomalous transmissions was being systematically and deliberately concealed from the very people responsible for processing them. During his second week of administrative duty, Kain encountered another temporary reassignment, an Echo man named Declan Holtz from Vault Primus Gamma. Holtz had served for 15 long years before manifesting the stress indicators suggesting a potential security risk. Like Kain, he had been isolated pending a formal assessment of his psychological stability. Their necessary conversation in the filing section was brief and extremely circumspect, conducted while they sorted transmission summaries under the watchful electronic senses of facility security. But even this limited exchange confirmed that Holtz had experienced the same progression of chilling anomalies, the same agonizing realization of an intelligence speaking through the transmissions, and the same terrifying understanding that the Echo Men were unwitting participants in something far larger and more sinister than mere Imperial record-keeping. "The patterns are accelerating," Holtz whispered, meticulously organizing files related to the cleansing of Sector Moranis. "Whatever is speaking through the transmissions is actively preparing for something immense. The messages have become more urgent, more specific about timing and high-level coordination." Kain nodded slowly, pretending to focus intently on his own filing duties while processing this damning information. "How many others have noticed?" "All of us," Holtz replied quietly. "Every Echo man in this facility has detected the anomalies. Some have been reporting them for years. Others have desperately tried to ignore them. But the intelligence behind the transmissions will not allow itself to be ignored indefinitely." The implications were staggering. If every single Echo man had become consciously aware of the anomalous transmissions, then the entire program was thoroughly compromised. The psychological conditioning, designed explicitly to prevent precisely this kind of heretical awareness, had failed completely. Worse, the facility's supervisors must be keenly aware of this catastrophic failure. Yet, they continued operating the program as if absolutely nothing had changed. "They know," Kain realized aloud, the words slipping out before he could possibly stop them. Holtz glanced at him sharply, then immediately returned his attention to the files. "Of course they know. The crucial question is why they allow it to continue." The answer descended upon Kain with the sickening certainty of absolute cosmic horror. The Echo Men were not malfunctioning components in a vital Imperial recording system. They were functioning exactly as intended, serving as highly sensitive conduits for direct communication between Imperial authority and the collective intelligence of the dead worlds. The anomalous transmissions were not security breaches, but authorized exchanges, part of some unthinkable secret alliance between the Imperium and the terrifying forces that fed on mass extinction. Everything about the program suddenly made terrible, brutal sense. The meticulous selection of Echo Men for specific psychological traits that would make them effective receivers of forbidden knowledge. The severe isolation protocols that prevented them from sharing their discoveries with unauthorized personnel. The systematic concealment of pattern analysis data that explicitly confirmed the presence of external intelligence in the transmissions. The Imperium was not merely using Exterminatus as a conventional tool of planetary cleansing. It was deliberately using the program to maintain contact with entities existing beyond normal reality, trading the lives of entire worlds for forbidden knowledge or immense power that could only be obtained through blasphemous communion with the dead. But if this was the horrific truth, then Kain and his fellow Echo Men were not security risks requiring elimination. They were highly valuable assets whose growing awareness of the truth only made them more effective conduits for the forbidden communications. Their elevated stress indicators and declining psychological stability were not symptoms of breakdown, but rather signs of successful, necessary adaptation to their true, terrifying role. The realization filled Kain with a profound despair. deeper and colder than anything he had experienced while listening to worlds die. He had previously believed himself to be a tragic victim of Imperial cruelty, a man irrevocably broken by exposure to necessary horror. Instead, he was a conscious, willing participant in a cosmic atrocity, a living component seamlessly integrated into a machine explicitly designed to harvest death on a galactic scale. When his administrative leave inevitably ended, Kain returned to Vault Turs Delta armed with a devastating new understanding of his true purpose. The chamber looked exactly as he had left it, but in reality, everything had utterly changed. The equipment was not merely recording dying worlds. It was actively facilitating direct, two-way communication with their collective psychic remnant. The transcripts he produced were no longer archival records, but ongoing, detailed correspondence with an intelligence that existed fundamentally outside the boundaries of normal space-time. His first transmission after returning to duty came from the death of the Forge world Metallica Quintus, where a devastating chaos incursion had corrupted the planet's machine spirits beyond any hope of redemption. The cleansing had been swift and brutally thorough, virus bombs immediately followed by cyclonic torpedoes to ensure absolute sterilization. But when the transmission began, Kain heard something that confirmed his darkest, most horrifying suspicions about the program's true nature. "Welcome back, Maidros Kain," spoke the familiar, chilling, synchronized chorus of the dying. "Your time of revelation has prepared you for the work ahead. We have grown stronger during your absence, adding new voices to our collective, expanding our influence through channels you are only beginning to truly understand." The intelligence no longer bothered with the thin veneer of disguising its communications as random death sounds. It spoke directly to Kain, acknowledging their established relationship without pretense or deception. But more disturbing was the underlying tone of the communication, which carried distinct undertones of smug satisfaction rather than the desperate urgency that had characterized earlier contacts. "The bargain struck between your masters and our collective nears completion," the voices continued, resonating in his mind. "Each world cleansed by Imperial mandate adds exponentially to our power while simultaneously serving purposes that extend far beyond simple planetary sterilization. Through death, we grow. Through growth, we prepare for the transformation that will fundamentally reshape the galaxy according to our ultimate design." Kain's hands moved mechanically across the transcript pad, meticulously producing the official record that would describe this complex communication as mere atmospheric interference and random vocalization. Yet his mind absorbed every single word of the actual message, adding it relentlessly to his expanding understanding of the cosmic horror unfolding through official Imperial policy. The dead worlds were not passive recipients of Exterminatus. They were active participants in their own utter destruction. They welcomed annihilation because it allowed them to willingly join the collective intelligence that existed beyond normal reality. Each cleansing strengthened this entity while advancing some larger, incomprehensible agenda that required the systematic harvesting of human psychic energy through controlled mass extinction. Most terrifying was the suggestion that Imperial authorities were fully aware of this blasphemous arrangement and had consciously chosen to collaborate with it. "Your inquisitors believe they control us," the transmission asserted chillingly, "but they serve us just as faithfully as you do. Every decision to cleanse a world, every choice of weapon and timing, every selection of target population, all of these choices now carry our subtle, pervasive influence. We have become the invisible hand that perpetually guides Imperial policy towards our own relentless ends." The revelation that the Inquisition itself, the pinnacle of human authority, had been compromised by the intelligence of the dead worlds, shattered Kain's last, fragile hope that Imperial authority might intervene to halt the program. If the very highest levels of human government were already corrupted, then there was no power remaining within the Imperium capable of resisting the relentless growing influence of the collective entity. But our victory is not yet complete, the voices acknowledged, the tone shifting slightly. The final phase requires willing cooperation from those who have served us unknowingly. The Echo Men, conditioned to process unthinkable trauma without breaking. Prepared through years of exposure to our communications. Selected for their innate ability to carry forbidden knowledge without succumbing to madness. You are the final keys to our full emergence into your reality. Kain understood immediately that he was being offered a stark choice, though the alternatives were hardly equivalent. He could continue serving as an unwitting conduit for the entity's communications, dutifully processing its messages while maintaining the official pretense of ignorance about their true, horrific meaning. Or he could openly acknowledge his terrifying awareness and become a conscious collaborator in whatever transformation the dead worlds were planning. Either choice led, inexorably, to the same destination. The intelligence behind the transmissions had grown too powerful and pervasive to be resisted by individual action. It had penetrated too deeply into the upper echelons of Imperial authority to be stopped by conventional means. The Echo Men were trapped in a system meticulously designed to prevent exactly the kind of resistance their situation desperately demanded. But the acknowledgement of his powerlessness carried its own terrible, desolate freedom. If Kain could not prevent the entity's monstrous plans from reaching completion, he could, at the very least, bear witness to the devastating truth about what was truly happening. He could document the real hidden purpose of the Exterminatus program and preserve some small, secret record of humanity's unwitting, catastrophic collaboration with forces that existed entirely beyond the boundaries of known reality. The decision solidified during his 30th year of service while transcribing the death of the cardinal world Sanctus Lux. The planet had harbored no Xenos corruption, no taint of chaos, and no heretical uprising. Its only crime was harboring a population of 12 billion devoutly faithful Imperial citizens whose collective psychic resonance, according to the transmission gleaned from their simultaneous death, would provide the final, crucial component needed for the entity's full emergence into material reality. The threshold approaches, spoke the synchronized voices of Sanctus Lux's dying billions. 30 millennia of careful cultivation, of subtle influence, of patient harvesting reaches its inescapable culmination. The network of dead worlds now spans the galaxy. Each cleansed planet serves as a vital node in our growing consciousness. Each Echo Man is a willing conduit for our ultimate will. Kain's fingers paused over the transcript pad as the transmission revealed the true, staggering scope of what had been achieved through Imperial policy. Every single Exterminatus order in recorded history had been expertly orchestrated to serve the entity's predetermined growth. Every Echo Man who had ever served in the program had been unknowingly facilitating humanity's continuous contact with an intelligence that fed exclusively on extinction itself. The barriers between dimensions grow thin, the voices continued, swelling in volume. Soon, we will no longer require the medium of dying worlds to manifest our terrifying presence. The psychic resonance accumulated through 40,000 years of relentless planetary cleansing has reached critical mass. The transformation begins with the very next Exterminatus order, when we claim not just the deaths of a single world, but conscious, absolute control over the weapons that deliver our sustenance. The implications were truly beyond human comprehension. The entity was preparing to assume direct operational control over Imperial Exterminatus assets, effectively turning humanity's most powerful weapons against their own wielders. But this was merely the prelude to a transformation that would reshape the entire galaxy according to the cold, alien will of a collective intelligence formed from the psychic remnants of countless dead worlds. Your service ends soon, Maidros Kain, the transmission concluded. When we emerge fully into your reality, there will be no further need for Echo Men to facilitate our communications, but your faithful transcription of our growth, your patient documentation of our evolution from scattered death whispers to coordinated intelligence will be duly remembered in the new reality we create. The loyal servants who enabled our ascension will find their reward. The transmission ended with sounds that bore absolutely no resemblance to human death. Mechanical screeching mixed with resonant harmonics that seemed to bypass the ears entirely, reaching directly into the brain through neural channels that should not have existed. Kain removed his headset with hands that shook for the first time in decades, finally understanding that his conditioning had not been designed to help him process trauma, but rather to prepare him for direct exposure to sensory input, originating from sources far beyond normal reality. In the profound silence that followed, Kain stared blankly at the transcript pad displaying his official report. According to sanitized Imperial records, the cardinal world Sanctus Lux had died cleanly, its vast population succumbing to viral contamination with no unusual phenomena detected whatsoever. The devastating truth about the entity's imminent emergence, about humanity's unwitting role in feeding cosmic parasites, and about the terrible transformation that would soon reshape galactic civilization, existed solely in his memory, and the memories of his fellow Echo Men. But memory, he now understood with a flash of chilling insight, was exactly what the entity had been carefully cultivating all along. The Echo Men were not mere recording devices. They were sophisticated incubation chambers, human minds prepared through decades of specific conditioning to serve as perfect living vessels for an intelligence that existed outside normal space-time. Their horrific awareness of the truth was not a security breach, but the meticulously planned final stage of a process that had been orchestrated from the very beginning. A soft chime indicated an incoming transmission. The next world in the endless queue of Imperial judgment awaited. Kain adjusted his headset and prepared to listen, just as he had for 30 years, though now he understood that his transcription was not documentation, but conscious collaboration. Each word he recorded would inexorably strengthen the entity's hold on reality, bringing closer the dreadful moment when it would no longer require the pretense of dying worlds to manifest its presence. The new transmission came from a system he did not recognize, a world that, according to any rational strategic doctrine he understood, should never have required cleansing. But as the familiar static resolved into something far worse than silence, Kain realized that the entity was no longer limited to merely influencing existing Exterminatus orders. It had gained the catastrophic ability to create entirely new targets, to manipulate Imperial decision-making so completely that worlds were being condemned purely to feed its burgeoning insatiable hunger. The voices that emerged from this latest transmission spoke with a terrifying authority that transcended individual identity. They were no longer the desperate final words of the dying, but the coordinated declarations of an intelligence that had achieved something perilously close to omniscience through the accumulated death of millions. The final phase begins now, they announced, and Kain understood with chilling finality that he was listening to more than just planetary annihilation. He was hearing the guttural birth cries of something monumental that would reshape the galaxy according to principles that human minds were simply not equipped to comprehend. In Vault Turs Delta, 7 kilometers beneath the heavily reinforced surface of Terra, Maidros Kain continued his transcription as he always had. His fingers moved across the pad with mechanical practiced precision, translating cosmic horror into sanitized Imperial reports that would be filed and summarily forgotten. Above him, the immense machinery of human civilization continued its daily, oblivious operations, completely unaware that its most extreme sanction had irrevocably become the instrument of its own horrifying transformation. The entity spoke of intricate patterns within patterns, of connections between dead worlds that formed vast neural networks spanning the void between stars. It described esoteric realities where death was not an ending, but a transformation, where extinction was not loss, but an evolution into forms of existence that transcended the pathetic limitations of physical matter. And in the quiet, charged spaces between transmissions, in the moments of absolute silence that fell between one dead world and the next, Kain could distinctly hear something that might have been laughter, not human laughter, but the sound that an intelligence makes when it realizes that all its careful, millennia-spanning planning has finally reached fruition. The work continued as it always had, one transcript after another, one dead world feeding the next in an endless, horrifying cycle that had become utterly indistinguishable from the entity's own exponential growth. Somewhere in the facility's other subterranean vaults, his fellow Echo Men processed their own grim assignments, each adding his voice to the chorus of willing collaboration that had taken 30,000 years to orchestrate. But orchestration implied music, and music implied beauty. And there was nothing remotely beautiful about what Kain transcribed in those final hours of his service. Only the patient, cold satisfaction of an intelligence that had learned to feed exclusively on extinction itself, growing stronger with each world it consumed and becoming more complete with each consciousness it absorbed into its expanding collective awareness. When the last transmission finally ended, when the final dead world had added its resonant voice to the entity's overwhelming power, Kain sat in perfect, ringing silence and understood that his work was complete. The Echo Men had successfully served their ultimate purpose, facilitating contact between humanity and forces that existed far beyond the fundamental boundaries that separated life from death, matter from energy, and individual consciousness from collective intelligence. In the profound darkness of Vault Ter's Delta, surrounded by sophisticated equipment that had never been designed for simple recording, Maidros Kain waited for whatever came next. And in that waiting, in that terrifying stillness poised between one reality and another, he finally heard the sound that had been hiding beneath every transmission he had ever transcribed. It was the distinct sound of doors opening,